So I'm going to jump right in and we will continue with the reading from the Bhagavad Gita. And now, verse 18 says the following: enlightened men are those who see the same, that means the Atman, in a Brahmana, which means in a holy person, with learning and humility, in a cow, in an elephant, and even a dog, and then they push it really forwards and they say, or the eater of a dog meat, which would be an outcast in India. So it is clear now that from this perspective, what is said by Krishna is that indeed an enlightened human being will be able to see, if we simplify the whole sentence, will be able to see the soul or the divine consciousness everywhere. And that's what is called Atman, and it is everywhere actually. An enlightened person would be able to perceive that, which is a big thing to say, as you probably realize. Even here in this embodied state, I'm continuing to the next verse. The cycle of births and deaths have been overcome by those who have this vision of sameness in all. So now he adds another thing to it, and he says that those who have this vision, that means seeing the Atman everywhere, they will overcome the reincarnation cycle, to put it simply. Moving on, he says, verily Brahman is the unsullied and the pure. So in other words, the Brahman is simply pure and can never be tainted. That's what he means. Brahman is the unsullied and pure, therefore are those seers of sameness said to be established in Brahman. In other words, he says those who have this vision of being able to see Brahman everywhere become as pure as Brahman. He continues, unperturbed and undiluted, a knower of Brahman who is established in him neither rejoices at pleasant experiences nor gets agitated at unpleasant ones. So he says, in other words, that the one who is really not just focused but literally in Brahman, the one who is the knower of Brahman, the one who is established in Brahman, will simply have a very balanced view of life. That means at that level, the person is not disturbed by pleasure or displeasure. They are fully balanced in any situation. An aspirant who is unattached to the contractual or contactual experiences, in other words, the physical experiences that we interact with, of the external world, he continues saying, gains the joy that is in the self within. That means as long as you are attached and dependent on whatever is happening externally to determine if you're happy or not, and this is a big statement because we are all like that. Is it nice weather today? I'm feeling happy, right? Did I have a nice meal? Oh, then I'm okay. Was it a storm and rain today and it was very dark and a very gray day? Then I'm kind of unhappy, right? And so on and so forth. There are a million things or more that continuously the external world does that affects us. But here he is explaining that the one who is unattached, in other words, detached to the contactual experiences of the external world, if you are not, in other words, dependent on the external world to tell you if you're happy or not, upset or not, or whatever, if you're detached, then he says, you gain the joy that is in the self within. Because in the self, there's no bad days, there's no rainy days, there's no negative experiences, there's nothing to worry about. In the self, there's always pure joy. And that's why in that state, you are free, because you're free from all the chaoticness of the external world and how it affects you. He enjoys unending bliss with his mind absorbed in communion with Brahman. So this is clear. If the mind is not upset or happy because of external experiences, if the mind is actually absorbed in Brahman, you are absorbed in bliss, and you will always be blissful no matter what the external circumstances may be. And that's, of course, very important. Whatever enjoyments are there born of sense contact, they are sources of suffering only. Isn't that amazing? Because right now, he demolished all your attachments by saying, whatever enjoyments are there, and they are born of what? How do we get pleasure? Because it is triggering experiences that we interpret as pleasurable on our senses. I see a beautiful scenery, I'm saying, oh, I feel good. I'm eating and there's a sense of taste of something which is tasty, then I get a pleasurable feedback from the brain. And so on and so forth. All the things from sexuality to any other activity that we do, these are all activities that are triggered by our senses. And therefore he says here that whatever enjoyments are there, which are born from our sense contact, they are sources of suffering only. You might ask, how is that possible? I just had a pleasurable experience, right? So how am I suffering? Why are you telling me I'm suffering? I'm on a vacation on a tropical island. I'm happy, I'm not suffering. Really? Well, let's study it a bit deeper. Let's finish the verse and then I'll comment on this. For, now he explains, they are with a beginning and an end. A wise man finds no delight in them. Because what is the point of allowing yourself to feel happy and enjoy a very temporary experience? He says here. This is exactly what Buddha says, and he calls it impermanence. Because all those experiences, I'm not saying we should be depressed and never enjoy anything in life. We should not be attached to those things. If you can enjoy in a detached state, which is exactly what a spiritual person, and even more so a tantric person would do, and you can enjoy without being attached, in that condition, then it is okay to enjoy everything that you want because you're not attached to it. And that's what he says here. If you're attached, then what happens is that it has a beginning, but unfortunately that pleasurable experience has an end. And because you're attached to it, when the end comes, you suffer. Oh, where is my ice cream? I finished my ice cream and now I am depressed because my ice cream is gone. Never again will I have it. Right? So we have this kind of experience with life. And of course, I'm being a humorous saying ice cream, but this applies to everything. What about the fact that we are attached to other people? And guess what? People don't last forever. It's a very sad thing. We don't want to think about death, but death comes for everyone. And then when someone close to us, your wife, your husband, your child, your parent, whatever, maybe a good friend, somebody dies, and we are torn to pieces. We are in mourning. We feel horrible. Why? Because we had a good experience to have that person in our lives, usually, or at least that's what we remember. And now it has been taken away from us. It has an end. The experience has an end. Even if it was 80 years, it's still temporary. So that's what he says here. And I continue. Here, even while in the body, whoever is able to withstand the agitation caused by the lust and anger, so he says, as long as you are still living in the body, if you can resist the agitation that is caused by lust and anger, these are two big things in our lives, he is the self-controlled one. He is a happy man. So controlling lust and anger. You might ask, out of all the bad qualities, why lust and anger being so put to the front here? And the answer is simple. Lust and anger are two of the root impurities that cause all the other impurities to manifest. Lust comes from the sexual energy which is uncontrolled. Anger comes as well because of unresolved or uncontrolled or unmanifested desires. So it is actually desire is the root of both anger and lust. And as long as we cannot control it, we suffer. He says here, if you can, that's a happy man. And he continues here, saying, the yogin whose happiness is within, whose resting place is within, who likewise experiences the light within, he realizes himself to be the spirit and attains to beatitude in Brahman. So this is quite clear. If we can enjoy happiness not because of external circumstances or anything that the senses are telling us, but inside of us resides the happiness, which is the Brahman state or the Atman. Same if you can experience rest within. So you really need to find the ultimate resting place, which is actually within you. It's not about finding it in some, remote place where you can sit quietly and nobody bothers you and you have a vacation for a while. That's not the ultimate rest. A person can bring hell with them to paradise. If you have hell inside of you, if you have torture inside of you, wherever you go, no matter how beautiful or quiet the place may be, you bring the suffering with you. And that is why he says here that it is about internal rest. Once you reside in Atman, in Brahman within, you allow yourself to merge with it. You really attain peace, inner peace, rest, like you've never experienced before. That's why Swami Shivananda used to say, the one who is really spiritually accomplished, as we describe here, can even sit in the middle of a marketplace full of noise, smells, agitation, screaming, whatever, can sit there, close the eyes, and be in complete peace because they meditate and nothing disturbs the peace within. So that one, plus if you can experience the light within, that's a bit more high of a concept, because to experience light, many spiritual practitioners who have reached the state of samadhi, in that high state of consciousness, they report that they actually perceive a very, very high form of light. This is not light like many of you say, oh, I meditated, I've seen some light, so I think I'm there already. You're not. Because this is not just the light that most people see when they close their eyes. We can see all kinds of stuff. This is usually astral phenomenon, and that has nothing to do with spiritual accomplishment. The kind of light which he discusses here is something that a person can reach in very high states of consciousness, and that light has nothing to do with the light that you are familiar with. It's something else. So that is the kind of light he's talking about here. Then he says that kind of a person, he says here, he realizes himself to the spirit and attains the beatitude within. The beauty within is attained truly then. Verily, they attain to beatitude in Brahman who are sinless, whose doubts have been destroyed, whose self is under their control, and who rejoice in the good of all. So he gives a few more hints of what would be that kind of a person. And he explains that kind of a person attains this beatitude of Brahman, this beauty of the soul. In other words, he says, who are sinless, which means you do not have any sins, You can clear yourself of sins. We can say, if you have managed to burn your karma, that would be a way we talk about it in yoga. Whose doubts have been destroyed. Being doubtful is not something that is conducive for spiritual enlightenment. And you have to think about it, because the scientific method is all about doubting. So that's why spiritual people are not big fans of science. Yes, science is cool. We have internet, we have smart devices, we have electricity, we have so many things. Science is awesome, right? Yes, but science always has the science methodology behind it, which is, first you need to doubt. Don't accept anything without proof. That kind of a thing actually is a problem from a spiritual perspective, because spiritually speaking, we start first with faith and belief, even and especially when we don't have proof. And that's how we progress. And that's why doubts, he says here, doubts have been destroyed. So if you can destroy all doubts, that's a step up. And whose self is under their control. And that's interesting, because here he doesn't refer to the ultimate self, Atman. He actually is talking about the mind. Sometimes self is confused with the mind. So here in this translation, they call it self, but actually we're talking about the mind. So if the mind is under control, and just to top it all off, there is some anahata there as well, some heart chakra, he says that is the kind of person who rejoices in the good of all. How many people do you know who actually rejoice, authentically rejoice, that everyone has good in their lives? It's very difficult. Many of us say, yes, I want people to be happy, except Johnny, who upsets me, and Mary, who is really a nasty woman, and this and that. And we have a lot of these issues. It's very difficult for us to truly, really believe and want that everyone should be blissful and happy, and we rejoice in good for all. So that is a challenge. What else? One second here. Just need to sort out the oil lamp. A little bit more oil. And we're good to go. So, having said that, we continue. To those self-controlled ones, he calls them ascetics, but it doesn't have to be. There can also be tantrics. He says, who are free from lust and anger, who have controlled their minds and who have known their real nature as the spirit, the attainment of beatitude in Brahman is near at hand. So, to sum up, he adds a few more points here. He says those who are self-controlled, that means they control the mind, who are free from lust. As we said, lust could be a problem, right? Lust and anger. So he says free of lust and anger, who have controlled their minds. I'm saying it here because you might ask, but in the beginning you said that the self-controlled, that's the same thing. But here when he says self-control, it's true. It means the mind eventually, but actually he's referring to the fact that those of you who control themselves like an ascetic can. In other words, that they are not slaves to their desires. But when you think about it, eventually that means mental control as well. So it's different aspects of controlling the mind. Continuing, and who have known their real nature as spirit. That means those who truly perceive the spirit as their true nature. The attainment of beatitude, he says, at that point in Brahman is near at hand. So the success is very near. Excluding all sense perceptions, fixing the look between the eyebrows, so fixing the look between the eyebrows, steadying the flow of prana, outgoing breath, and apana, incoming breath, through the nostrils, controlling the senses, mind and intellect, devoid of desires, fear and anger, and aspiring for liberation alone, a meditation, let me see here, a meditative sage is liberated forever. All right, this was a big mouthful. This verse is very important, so I'm going to have to analyze it a bit for you and clarify some things. So let's understand it. So he is basically describing a technique here, or a cluster of techniques. And by doing this process that he's describing right here, he says that the person has the capacity to become liberated forever. In other words, we're talking about a full enlightenment. So this is important because in the Bhagavad Gita, now and again, Krishna actually presents some techniques which are very powerful. So I'm going to talk about this technique right now. So let's understand it a little bit better. So he says, excluding all sense perceptions. So what does it mean? It means the senses will keep getting input. This we cannot avoid. What we can do is not respond to them. And that is what is called in yoga, according to Patanjali, the famous yogi, it's called pratyahara. That is an ability to simply isolate your senses from the external disturbances or input of the senses. And that's exactly what he's recommending here to start with. You need to go into a place within yourself where the input of your senses is simply not registering anymore, temporarily, and it doesn't disturb your mind at all. So that's that. Next, fixing the look between the eyebrows, steadying the flow of prana. We'll get to the prana in a minute, but first, steadying the look between the eyebrows, right here. Now, when you look right here, that means that your eyes go cross-eyed temporarily, because actually you're not looking here. When you think of it from the side, you're actually looking at your third eye, which is a little bit outside the forehead. When you look from the eye towards the third eye, which is a little bit in front of your forehead, then you're actually looking through the center of the eyebrows right here. So that's why he says concentrate there, because this is a smart way of saying focus on your Ajna chakra, the third eye. So, next he gives another thing, which this one can be very challenging for many of you who haven't studied yoga. So let me explain it a little bit better. He says that steadying the flow of prana and apana through the nostrils, controlling the senses. So what is apana? What is prana? What's going on here? Prana is the life force. As many of you know, we're talking about the life force of the human being, the life force of the universe. This is prana in Sanskrit. And in other languages, like in Chinese, it's called chi, like Tai Chi. In Japanese, they call it ki, like Aikido. And this would be simply the life force. Prana is the life force that when we inhale into the body, we absorb this life force inside ourselves. But there's also another type. Actually, there are 5 types of pranas that we discuss in other teachings in our yoga levels. But for now, I'll just briefly explain it. Another type of this energy is called apana. Apana is the downward flowing energy. Prana is usually the energy at the level of the chest. So the idea, and you will find this if you study yoga seriously. When I say seriously, because a lot of people just go to the gymnastic style of yoga these days, Ashtanga yoga and all the rest, which are not yoga at all. But when you study yoga properly, at some point, especially in our courses we presented, that you understand the way energy works. And that means that one of the key elements, and you will find this if you study the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, Geranda Samhita, Shiva Samhita, and many of the yogic texts describe this. They say that always it is important for the yogi to unite together the prana and apana. When we put together prana and apana, that's when suddenly we go very high. We can even have a kundalini effect. Think of it like plus minus. You put them together, you get the zero polarity, and something amazing can happen. So he says we need to unite the prana and apana, he says here, through the nostrils. And that's because you can do this through a certain type of pranayama, which I cannot teach you here. This is coming later on in our courses, but you understand that this involves a certain pranayama. All right. And then he continues, controlling the senses, mind, and intellect, because when you balance the prana and apana, as I said, you can go into a higher state, and then it becomes easier to control the mind and intellect. Devoid of desires. This is no time for desires. At this point, you let them go. Fear and anger specifically should be let go. And aspiring for liberation alone. This is important. You need to truly yearn for liberation. A meditative sage is liberated forever, he says. So by combining this practice, you can truly liberate yourself. Don't think that this is done in a matter of seconds. Usually this is something that takes years of practice. So it's a technique actually, and it is taught in our courses when you go deeper into it, especially in the Kundalini Yoga program, we go into these type of things. But as you do that, you unite the prana and apana, you control the mind, you go deeper, and there is a yearning for liberation coming strongly from within you. That's when things can start changing big time. So that was a big verse, and I wanted to explain it here. So let's move on. Knowing me, now he continues in the next verse. He says, Krishna says, knowing me, the recipient, let me just fix my light here, it's a bit dark. The recipient of all worship and austere practices. Who is the recipient? He says, knowing me, as if Krishna, Krishna, he says, is the recipient of all worship and austere practices. You might say, what about those who worship Shiva, or those who worship, I don't know, Vishnu or somebody else? How can Krishna says, oh, it's all about me? Sounds a bit egocentric, but I'll explain it in a second. He continues, the Supreme Lord of all the worlds, he has quite a high opinion of himself, you might say, the Supreme Lord of all the worlds, and the friend of all beings, man attains to eternal peace. So it all comes, he says, from knowing me. Either the guy is very self-centered and has a very high opinion of himself, or he is actually not a man. And that's the whole point. Krishna is considered to be an avatar. An avatar means that this is a reincarnation of a soul which is not human. He is actually known to be one of the reincarnations of Vishnu. Therefore, at that level, when he says knowing me or worship me, he doesn't mean me, Krishna, who has this face and this body, who likes bananas and I don't know what. This is not a personal thing. It's a transpersonal thing. When he says me, he says everything. It's Atman, it's the Brahman. By knowing Brahman, through me, he says, I could be a conduit. When I say me, I mean the divine. Then he says, by knowing me, which is, he calls it here, the recipient of all worship and austere practices. Because when we do worship, when we do austere practices, when you do sacrifices, when you do consecration, when you do all these things, you do it to the divine, always to the divine consciousness. And that divine consciousness, Krishna says, exists everywhere. The only problem is most people cannot perceive it. Even if they say, okay, intellectually I understand, I have the divine in me. It doesn't mean that they actually perceive it. but Krishna does. He lives it. It's like a state of Jesus, a state of Krishna. These are kind of people that we call avatars. They are in a constant Bhava Samadhi state, completely illuminated 24/7. And therefore, when he talks, when he breathes, when he goes to the bathroom, whatever Krishna does, it is divine. It is God in action. And that's why he says, knowing me, the recipient of all worship, you will be liberated. So that's his statement. This is not an ego thing. This is a real thing. So with this, we have finished chapter 5. And in the next meeting, we will discuss chapter 6. So we have finished 5th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Next we'll go to chapter 6. So now it's time to take a few questions. Let's see if anybody's got any questions at this point. I'll just check here. Yeah. So we have a couple of questions, not too many I think at this point, but if you have any questions coming in your mind about any spiritual teachings that fit to this group, or specifically about Bhagavad Gita, now is a good time to put your questions in our chat box there, and I will answer them. All right. Penelope is asking, would you agree that it's important not to surpass or to suppress anger or any emotion inside yourself, but go behind the emotion and see where it is coming from? So you are allowing it to be there rather than expressing it wrongly. From my opinion, suppressed anger is also dangerous for yourself and to society. Of course, we are not talking about suppression of any kind. We're not suppressing any emotions at all. When Krishna talks about controlling the emotions, he is talking first and foremost about developing detachment. When we understand detachment, which is not indifference or suppression or any of these things, detachment is a state of remembrance. When we continuously remember and realize our true nature being the absolute, and therefore we are not identifying with our emotional self. And by doing that, we have a different state of consciousness, a different state of mind. That's where detachment comes from. That's why we keep saying to you, detachment is actually coming ultimately from the crown chakra, Sahasrara. And at that level, you are already having a different, an altered, or even an advanced state of consciousness, because you see yourself for what you truly are. It's not perfect yet, but you are on the road there. And at that state of detachment, from that position, you can look at your emotions, if it's anger or whatever. Of course, you don't suppress them. You don't also identify with them, and you definitely don't allow them to control you or to explode uncontrollably within you. What we do is we go beyond these emotions. Of course, if you want to look at it psychologically, it would be good to do some psychotherapy and find out where is the source of these emotions, what is the ultimate cause behind, and maybe deal with that cause, and then that would make the emotion go away by itself. But of course, this is a long process, and in many cases it doesn't work, because people may say, okay, I realize the cause, but sometimes even if you have neutralized the cause, you are so habitually in that state of emotional expression, like people who are for 20 years used to responding with anger to any situation in life, even if they realize, oh, I was angry for years because when I was a kid, my dad did this to me or that to me or whatever. Good, now I understand, but I don't know any better. This has been my go-to behavior for 20 years. So I can't, just because I neutralized and understood what made it happen 20 years ago, doesn't mean that now suddenly I have a new way of interacting with the world. I don't. I need to learn something new. And that is why when we're talking about this kind of attitude, it's not just repression, it's not any of these things. We are actually talking about detachment. And from a state of detachment, you can also open your heart chakra, and then you will need to work on changing these emotions, surpassing these emotions, not just treating the cause, the primal cause behind it. Of course, that's useful, but it doesn't necessarily resolve the situation fully. We need new tools, and those should be spiritual tools. That's why Anahata Chakra needs to be part of the process. Ben is asking, how should we go about our jobs, ambitions, wanting to make money, maybe a lot of it, and so on, in a spiritual way, given our crown chakra and detachment is not at the level of an advanced yogi yet? That's a good question, and that's why it's not just about being an advanced yogi, it's about being a tantric practitioner. That's where Tantra comes in. If we would be doing spirituality which is not of a tantric nature, then we would be more on the ascetic path. There's no other option. Unless you're simply not spiritual at all. And then fine, you do whatever. But when we are spiritual, on a spiritual path, then choosing the tantric path is a blessing. Because a tantric individual has the possibility, he or she, to interact with the world, to still be active, to still deal with, to be able to deal with, still deal with money, deal with love, emotions, partners, whatever comes, stress, everything that comes towards us, we can deal with it. Why? Because as tantric practitioners, we deal with the energy. We are never confused by what we experience. We can see emotions, we can see, traumas, problems, shifts in the world, crises. There's so many things which happen and can happen in the world, especially if you're not an ascetic, living in a monastery or in an ashram somewhere very far. Then if you are engaged with the world, then you need to be a tantric if you still want to be spiritual. As a tantric practitioner, you have the wisdom of realizing that everything is energy. And I mean everything. And when you understand that, then what is there to get upset about? Because this anger that we see around us, or crisis, or problem, or whatever, it's energy. And that's why if we want to make money, what do we want to make actually? We want more energy. Money is a form of energy. If we want to do business, if we want to interact with the world in other ways, fine. But realize that it's energy. And by treating it as energy, then you can have tools in Tantra to become good at controlling energy. And then you can do whatever you want to do, but you do it from a very high point of view, working with energy purely. And as a result of that, the success that you want or whatever, either it comes or it doesn't, that depends on your skill of working with energy, but at least you're not deluding yourself, making it into something that it's not. For example, let's say that you have a girlfriend and this lady is coming to you and she's having one day a very bad day and she's angry and upset and this and that. Okay, I respect that. She may be challenged in many ways, or maybe she's having a bad day or whatever. I understand that, but I don't wish to become part of the drama. I don't wish, and it doesn't mean that I don't care. It doesn't mean that I don't give the proper attention. It just means that I do not want to get caught in this Shakti storm. Instead, I realize that it is energy. And by realizing it, using tools, bringing yourself to Anahata Chakra, interacting at the level of the heart. But this is already skill. It's not just you trying to do things, whatever your mind is trying to compose at that point. No, we understand that this is energy going into extreme, and we want to deal with it tantrically. And that's why Tantra is one of the best things that we can do. So I hope this gives some idea. Ash is saying, hi Soma, thanks for this lecture. My question is how to focus the mind when doing yoga postures and also when interacting with the feminine. I would appreciate specific tools and techniques to use to apply. I'm also looking forward to reading Mind Control book by Shivananda. Okay. Right, so how to focus the mind when doing yoga postures. We need to simply observe the mind first. You can't try to focus the mind when you can't observe your mind. So when you observe your mind, what do you see? If you just stop and look at your own mind, you see images, you see thoughts, you see all kinds of stuff coming up randomly. And as you observe and keep insisting on observing, already the mind will get calmer and calmer. And then once the mind calms down more, you can do that in your yoga practice, then what happens is that you find that when you tell the mind, let's focus on a chakra, which is what we do in our yoga practice, the mind will obey more easily because it has been observed for a while and it knows that it can't just do whatever it wants. It has to be more obedient. The problem is that most of us just don't observe the mind at all. And if we do, it's only for a very short period of time because it feels like it's a hassle. Observe all the time. Observe my mind. Observe my... Oh, come on, just give me a break. Let me watch on Netflix. Let me just relax for a bit. And then what does it mean that you relax or watch a movie? You go into autopilot. And then the mind says, woohoo! And it can go and think freely and do whatever the heck it wants, and you have again zero control. But if you can observe the mind for long periods of time, it takes a while. Remember, this is a long practice, but as you get used to observing the mind, just looking at it and looking at it, now what comes up, now what comes up, don't expect amazing things. The mind comes up with a lot of nonsense. It's a lot of garbage that is circulating in most people's minds, honestly. And every time you think okay, I understand this is coming up, good. What do you think is going to happen? The mind's going to come up with the same nonsense again. And you would say, again? The mind just came up with the same stupidity? Yes. Nobody said that the mind is brilliant in this way. It can rotate like a broken record over the same nonsense again and again. Nevertheless, you keep observing it no matter what. If you can do that regularly, as much as you can during each day, you will start seeing big changes. And then when you do yoga or when you're interacting with the feminine, you will get much better success with what you do. Anne is asking, when a sage is reaching samadhi and then he is liberated, is it a state where there is no time or space? Does it mean that we can stay in such state and never come back to our body, a kind of death in consciousness? Actually, it depends. It's possible. But for a sage to leave the body permanently, that sage will need to stay in a full nirvikalpa samadhi state, which is one of the highest states of samadhi, for a long period of time. Usually it's about 3 weeks. If, for example, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa stayed for close to 3 weeks, non-stop, in a state of samadhi, nirvikalpa samadhi, and then his guru brought him back and told him that he cannot continue, simply because if he would have continued a little bit more, he would not be able to come back to the body anymore, because then it's like you are already made your move. You are in another country, so to speak. You are in samadhi land. There's no point in coming back to the physical body. The physical body the connection between the soul and the physical body snaps, because then you are free. So you might say it's a kind of death in consciousness. It can be, if it maintained for a very long time. Most enlightened beings who took it seriously like this, sages and masters, they didn't push the envelope. They considered that they are enlightened in this life for a reason. They want to share, help, support, teach, whatever, others. So they would kind of come back. They would go in enlightenment and come back, go and come back, so they can still interact with the world. Very few people you find like Ramakrishna, or greater than him, of course, like the Jesus Krishna type, who have been in such a state and stayed in it for so long and basically did not come back at all. There have been those who did it, but many preferred to, always be in the body as well. And that's why, when the body is growing old and eventually dies, then it's okay. Then they leave the body once and for all. But otherwise, they don't leave it beforehand. Mina is asking, as said, Krishna is embodiment of Vishnu. Vishnu is the preserver. Why is exactly the preserver aspect of God with Arjuna in this battle or war? Actually, because he needs to. The preserving force of the universe, which is manifested under the guise or under the title of Vishnu, needs to preserve spirituality as well in the world. And the thing is that at that time it was a time of a shift from the previous yuga to this yuga. And as a result of that, when you change from Dvarapa, was the previous yuga called Dvarapa, from Dvarapa yuga to Kali yuga, then that change is part of the maintenance that the universe has to, because these are cycles that need to be there. It's part of the universal cycle process. And because of that, there's some prayer going on in suddenly here. So some kirtans, bhajans. Sorry about that. This is India. I think we have a procession in front of the house. So you're all getting the India experience today. So as I was saying, as part of the process of preserving, Vishnu needs to poke his finger into manifestation, or the God, the divine consciousness, need to do that through Vishnu. And by poking his finger, he has to create the right events in this very delicate time, in the shift from Dvarapa to Kali Yuga. He needs to make the right conditions, and for that he needs to be present. So Krishna comes, a manifestation of Vishnu, and then he does many things. Krishna is talking to the various people, he's pushing various things, and as he pushes things forwards, he instigates the war. It's Krishna who engineered the whole war, actually. And he creates this war because that's the best thing that can happen. By having the good guys destroying the forces of evil, what happens is that now we have Kali Yuga ushered in successfully, and the universe continues in its process of the yugas. So that's why he is there, the preserver, as you call it, with Arjuna in the battle. That's the whole point of it, and that's what we will find will happen at the end of Kali Yuga, which we are very close to, it seems, where God will have to allow certain things to happen, and at some point, again, there will be another embodiment of Vishnu, apparently, to usher the next yuga and to facilitate the changes that need to come. This is how you preserve things, by making sure things happen the way they should. So I hope this clarifies. That was the last question, so I'm going to stop here. Otherwise, thank you all for joining me, and I'll see you again next time. Thank you.